welcome to the stage founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies and three-time mayor of New York City, Michael R. Bloomberg.
Well, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the 2021 Bloomberg New Economy Forum. It is really great to have such an extraordinary group together in person here in Singapore. We have more than 325 leaders in government and business that have made trips from all over the world, from 40 different countries. And to all of you, to our official partners whose names you see on the screens, and to our many friends and partners tuning in from around the world, thank you very much for joining all of us. At the start, let me thank the chairs of our New Economy Forum Advisory Board, Henry Kissinger, who's joining us by video, and Hank Paulson, who's joining us by sitting right there. Thank you for your continued leadership, Hank and Henry. Let me also express our sincere gratitude to Prime Minister Lee and the people of Singapore for their generous hospitality. This has been one of the most dynamic and innovative countries in the world, and this event wouldn't have happened without the close cooperation and partnership of the Prime Minister and his team. They have been very gracious hosts, and I want to encourage everyone to be very gracious guests and continue to abide by the regulations on mask wearing and social distancing. Our hosts are really very serious about that, and we are determined to help them. They're really trying to do the right thing to protect all of us and the citizens of their country. So we're glad to be here together, and I want to thank everyone for respectfully following the rules. I will say, when I go up the stairs and halfway up, I take off my masks. I realize just how little oxygen you get through them, but nevertheless, at least I feel safe, and you should too, as should your families. We have gathered here on this beautiful island of Sentosa, and having visited this over the years, I have learned enough Malay to know that the name translates to peace and tranquility. How much else I know in Malay, you can imagine. As our open video reminded us, that's quite a contrast to the world that we are living in today, and right here, there is peace and tranquility. Every year we come together for the forum to bridge divides between governments and businesses and get more leaders with different perspectives, talking face-to-face or video-to-video, as it happens to be. And as COVID continues to shine a spotlight on the world's disparities, our work is to build strong partnerships from east to west and take on even greater urgency and importance the battle against something that literally could destroy the world that we live in. Later in the program, we're going to show another video. In it, you will see that we posed a question to friends who couldn't be here. The question was, what one change does the world need to see coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic? And we think you'll find it fascinating, the variety of answers that we got to the question. There are plenty, but one answer to that question is something that I stressed at the UN Climate Summit in Scotland earlier this month. When it comes to reducing emissions, we know what we need to do. And in fact, some of us are already doing it, but we're not doing it fast enough, and not everybody is doing it. At the summit, we saw governments reach a much-needed deal. It was especially encouraging to see the US and China find some common ground, and more countries, including India, committed to more ambitious goals and energy and clean energy. We also saw cities and states and businesses, foundations and financial institutions step up and raise the bar on what we can achieve. But as we all know, commitments are words, and we need action. Action that can be measured, action that can be qualified, action that can become publicly reported, and action that will save lives. There are people out there every day dying, lots of people, tens of thousands of people, and we're sitting here. Let's make sure we do something to get the right ideas and then turn them into action. To phase out coal and to make an enormous difference in the levels of investment in clean energy, we need to win the battle against climate change from both the public and private sectors, and we have to work hand in hand like never before. So I don't think this forum could come at a better time. The First gathering of global business leaders since the UN's meeting in Glasgow is really a great opportunity for us to build on the momentum coming out of Scotland, and we have an extraordinary group here to do it. Leaders from many of the world's largest investors are here, including banks and asset managers and sovereign wealth funds, along with ministers from Asia, in Africa, Europe, and North and South America. And we can learn from each other, and a lot of the work that we do, we have to do together. I'm looking forward to the discussions on the main stage and to get some of the workshops also where a lot of the real practical work gets done. My foundation, I'm happy to say, has worked very hard with the Sierra Club to close coal-fired power plants in the United States. So far, in the last half a dozen years, we've closed 65% of all of the coal-fired power plants in America. They're either closed or in the process of shutting down. So we've really made a difference. We've also expanded the efforts in Europe, and 50% of the coal-fired power plants are either closed or in the process of closing. If the private sector can do that, you would think governments could do a lot more. And so that's one of the things we have to take away from here. Go back and tell our governments we're just not going to let them off the hook. And the time for just talk has come and it's gone. What makes this convention so successful each year is your active participation. So I want to thank you for your continued commitment. Peace and tranquility will always be the ideas that we aspire to, ideals that we aspire to, and they will become real only through the types of partnerships and actions that we forge together here at the Forum. Today we're going to hear from a number of leaders, including one we are honored to have join us once again this year at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. That is somebody that you will know and know about. We met nearly 20 years ago when he was the mayor of Beijing and I was the mayor of New York City. And like all effective mayors, he was a problem solver and led his city through the SARS epidemic and its economic impacts. And now on the world stage, he is an influential diplomat, and we are grateful that he could address the forum at this critical moment. But first, before we hear from the Vice President of China, Wang Qishan, let me welcome his one-time counterpart in government and his longtime friend and mine. This gentleman is one of the Forum's advisory board co-chairs and a founding member of the board of Bloomberg Philanthropies, and we are fortunate to have his the benefit of his extraordinary experience and insights. Hank, thank you. As they say, the podium and the video this year are yours.
Please welcome to the stage, Chair of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum Advisory Board, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and Chairman of the Paulson Institute, Henry M. Paulson.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my long-standing friend, Vice President Wang Qishan. He is a visionary, an historian, a philosopher, and a man of action. And I tell you, that's a very rare combination. And over his long career, he has advocated for and embraced reform. And reform isn't easy in a country as large and as complex as China. But he's proven over and over again he knows how to get difficult things done. Now that takes a lot of determination, it takes skill, and it takes courage. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to tell us today. And I'm hoping that China's going to continue to be embracing reform and opening up to competition. Now, Vice President of China, Wang Qishan.
Distinguished guests, it gives me great pleasure to attend the 2021 New Economy Forum virtually. On behalf of the Chinese government, I wish to extend warm congratulations on the opening of the forum and best wishes to all participating guests. As we meet, the international environment is undergoing profound changes, and the once-in-a-century pandemic continues to spread worldwide. The global economy has shown some signs of recovery. This foundation is not yet solid, as evidenced by the acute problems of sharp fluctuations, high fragility, and structural imbalances. The rise of protectionism and unilateralism and the backlash against economic globalization have also added to the uncertainties. In the face of these shifting circumstances, the Communist Party of China and the Chinese government have taken into account both domestic and international environments, followed a coordinated approach to COVID response and a socio-economic development, and made some progress in various endeavors. On the domestic front, we have grounded our efforts in the new development stage and applied the new development philosophy to foster a new development paradigm and pursue high-quality development. Following the general principle of seeking progress while ensuring stability, we have focused on managing our own affairs well in response to people's aspiration for a better life. On the external front, we have actively pursued high-level opening up and taken the initiative to share market opportunities with the wider world. We explicitly upheld true multilateralism, resolutely defended the world's common interests, and pushed forward high-quality Belt and Road cooperation. In the international cooperation against COVID-19, we have honored our commitments and lived up to our responsibility, making major contributions to the global fight against the coronavirus. Last week, the 19th CPC Central Committee successfully convened its 6th plenary session. The session comprehensively summarized the major achievements and historic experience of the CPC over the past century, and called upon the entire party and all Chinese people to work even harder toward the goal of building a great modern socialist country in all respects. A review of historical experience, an analysis of the reality, and examination of the trend of the times can all prove that China cannot develop in isolation of the world, and nor can the world develop without China. China will not waver in its resolve to deepen reform and expand opening up. China's development is a great cause that is part of the progress of the entire humanity. Going forward, China will keep its arms wide open, provide more market, investment, and growth opportunities to the world, and contribute its part to the building of a noble world economy and a community with a shared future for mankind. Distinguished guests, amid the complex global situation and tortuous economic recovery, there are also some new trends and opportunities. We need to be more open-minded, think more creatively, and take more pragmatic steps to jointly create a brighter future for the world economy. We need to join hands to fight COVID-19. The new dynamics in the COVID situation and response policies are now key factors affecting the global economic recovery. The international community should work in concert and follow a science-based attitude to tackle and defeat the virus. We need to support each other's response efforts and strengthen cooperation in monitoring tools, therapeutic medicines, and research, production, and mutual recognition of vaccines in order to effectively forge a synergy against the pandemic. We need to promote fair and equitable distribution of vaccines worldwide, and in particular, step up support for developing countries to ensure vaccine accessibility and affordability in the developing world and bridge the vaccine divide. We need to embrace the spirit of science, firmly oppose politicization of issues involving vaccines and origins tracing, and jointly build a global community of health for all. We need to join hands to build a noble world economy. Openness brings progress, whereas isolation leads to backwardness. We need to promote trade and investment liberalization and facilitation, bring down trade and knowledge barriers, stay away from discriminatory and exclusive rules and systems, and keep the functioning of supply chains stable and smooth. We need to jointly make the pie of convergent interests bigger, enhance the complementarity and the synergy of our national development strategies and regional and international development agendas, and make economic globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial for all. We need to improve development philosophies and models, resolve the issue of unbalanced and insufficient development, ensure more equal development opportunities, and make the fruits of development shared by all. We need to join hands to promote a green transition and innovation-driven development. All countries should uphold the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, earnestly implement the Paris Agreement on climate change, and the outcomes of COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. We need to coordinate efforts in economic growth, people's well-being, energy conservation, and emission reduction, and pursue a green and a low-carbon transition of the economy in a holistic way. We need to follow the general direction of the ongoing scientific and technological revolution and industrial transformation, and harness the power of scientific and technological innovation to drive the transformation and upgrading of economic, energy, industrial, and consumption structures. We need to accelerate the conversion of scientific and technological outcomes into actual productivity and make innovation a strong engine, propelling economic development and the green transition. We need to join hands to improve the global governance system. A fair, just, and equitable global governance system is an important safeguard for the steady growth of the world economy over the long run. We need to follow the principles of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, and uphold true multilateralism. We need to support the reform of the WTO in the right direction, support the inclusive development of the multilateral trading system, and support the lawful rights and interests of the developing members of the organization. we need to push forward the IMF governance reform to increase the representation and the voice of developing countries and emerging markets. We need to jointly discuss and formulate global digital governance rules, improve the multilateral institutions for digital economy governance, establish basic institutions and normative standards on the property rights, transactions, cross-border transmission, and the security protection of data resources. And jointly foster an open, fair, and a just environment for digital development. Distinguished guests, the China-US relationship is a matter of high interest to many. Yesterday, President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden had a virtual meeting. They had an extensive and in-depth exchange of views on the bilateral relations and other issues of mutual interest, and reached important common understandings. China and the United States are respectively the world's biggest developing country and the biggest developed country. Whether they can handle the relationship well bears on the future of the world. The two sides should act on the important common understandings reached between the two presidents, keep their focus on cooperation, and manage and control differences, so as to bring China-US relations back to the right track of sound and steady growth, and contribute to the global economic recovery and world peace and stability. To conclude, I wish the forum a full success.
Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg television anchor and chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia, Haslinda Amin.
Good morning, everybody. As you heard, I'm Haslinda Amin. We're going to start our program today by taking stock of how COVID-19 has upended business assumptions, changed the way we work, accelerated the march of technology, and rerouted trade. Now, more importantly, we'd like to look ahead. We're going to look to the future. Out of this catastrophe, a new economy is being born. How can we shape it in ways that protect the planet and advance prosperity for all? You know what? I think I forgot to remove my mask. Habits form in 4 months, and it's been almost 2 years. Now, before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. First, please share your thoughts during today's program on social media using the hashtag, if you haven't already downloaded. That hashtag is New Economy Forum. You can get that from the App Store. And once you're logged in, you'll be able to participate in our conversations on stage through the audience question function on the app. And the reason we're doing this is because, of course, as you saw, we're having masks, and it's quite difficult to get you to ask the questions via a microphone. Send us your questions. They'll go to our moderators. You can put them to individual speakers or the panelists. Now, we'll also be doing live audience polls. In fact, let's dive straight into that. Do our first poll of the day. Are you ready? What will be the pandemic's most enduring impact on business? Would it be remote work, reduced business travel, redundant supply chains, a greener economy? Do submit your questions, your answers. We'll take a look at the results slightly later during the first panel. But before we do that, to kick it off, we asked some of our New Economy Forum community members who could not be here today in person with us to tell us about the one thing they think must change coming out of the pandemic. Take a listen.
Less than 2% of the population in low-income countries are fully vaccinated at this point, and that is unacceptable.
We must build our own production capacities for vaccines and not rely on those facilities that exist in other countries. They attended to their own people first. So we were left with nothing.
Next time, we can't afford to waste valuable time creating a new mechanism and raising funds to mount a rapid and equitable global response.
Change must start here. COVID showed the paradox of the current global order, where trade flows, supply chains bounce back, and yet a vital supply, vaccines, was instantly politicized and continues to be.
In Africa, we had such a heavy reliance on imported vaccines, nearly 99%. And we need multilateral agencies to support those regional plans.
What we do now will shape success for all future generations. We should do one important thing: rethink how we all approach hiring in our companies. Because note, this is an unequal recovery.
I strongly believe that businesses can be a force for good. The time to act is now.
Please welcome our moderator, Haslinda Amin, and her panelists, CEO of MasterCard, Michael Miebach, founder and chairman of Bharti Enterprises and executive chairman of OneWeb, Sunil Bharti Mittal, and CEO of the Trip.com group, Jane Sun.
Now, the pandemic has had a profound impact on the world. We've seen scientific breakthroughs, digital innovation that got accelerated, but we've also seen political failures, divides, rich versus poor, east versus west, vaccine inequity prompting a loss of trust in governments as well as institutions. Meantime, businesses made a pivot to survive. Some changes are transient, others are here to stay. So what have we learned from this pandemic? Where do we go from here? How has COVID shaped the world? Michael, fair to say science saved the day. Vaccines made the pandemic manageable in a matter of months compared to the early 1900s with the flu. But yet, 5 million people have perished. It'll be another 6 months before 3/4 of the world gets vaccinated with the first jab. Where did we fall short?
Haslinda, I think there's no two ways about it. We fell short in multiple dimensions. They just, shared the tragic truth. Millions of lives were lost, and that's for sure true. Livelihoods were lost as well. So you would think that when you just consider the impact on small business, for example, clearly the hardest hit part of economy around the world, that we would have done a better job over the years, considering that small business is the biggest employer, to make them more resilient, and we didn't do that. The inequalities you talked about, east, west, rich, poor, the digital haves and the digital have-nots. I think we have done a slightly better job here, because clearly, as we were all locked up at home, the world actually did work. So some homework was done, but you can also see that the digital divide, for those that have not been included, for whom it hasn't worked at all, is opening further. So there's lots for us to do, and I think private sector plays a role. To your point about where failures happened, I think collaboration didn't happen to the degree that it could have between governments and private sector. I see much more of that as you think about putting technology to good use, partnerships on good policy, on standards that ensure that you can actually drive technology into everybody's hand around the world, so it can be that force for good. I'm optimistic that we're going to do better, and we actually took the learnings from what happened in the last 18 months.
And so we had all the time in the world to prepare for a crisis like the pandemic. What are some of the key takeaways?
Well, I have a slightly different take on this. I mean, you can never prepare for something like this. This was perhaps in our lifetime once that you'll see this. Simultaneous, almost everywhere in the world, they started to erupt. Countries which are not very affluent, emerging, India, South Asia, Africa, generally take a great deal of effort to deal with their normal circumstances. We don't have the medical care that is required to deal with our people in normal times. I mean, imagine a catastrophe like this, a pandemic like this. Who could have prepared themselves? The Western world, which is so advanced, was caught napping. So there was no question that countries like India or Bangladesh or Africa or Brazil would have ever coped with this. Yet, let's celebrate the human effort, the ingenuity of mankind. How we did well. Let's start with my own industry, telecommunications. People moved from urban centers to countryside, not in tens of thousands, not in millions, but hundreds of millions. People just moved from the urban centers. People moved overnight from offices to homes. The networks stayed the course. We shifted traffic overnight from urban to rural centers, from offices to homes. I personally say this is to be celebrated because, as Michael rightly said, work did not stop one day. We just continued. Medical support, emergency support, work from home, regular business, supply chains, everything worked well. 251 million people, maybe it's now 255 million people who have been afflicted by this virus. 5 million have unfortunately died. That's 2%. That's big. Every life must be lost, must be mourned. But the fact is, the world has come together remarkably against this deadly virus. So I would really say we've done well. And you can never, ever prepare for something like this.
But we could have done better. Jane, let's bring you into this conversation. I mean, sitting in China, what are the changes you're seeing today, which you didn't think possible 20 months ago?
Yes, the pandemic has presented tremendous challenge for the world. Yet we have seen a great collaboration in our industry. The technology made it possible for us to stay connected with each other. And more so, I see the people care about each other, no matter there is a border among us. So at the beginning of the pandemic, China was the first country which went into the pandemics. And we received a tremendous support from people all around the world, from Europe, Italy, India, United States, everywhere. Once China was out and the other country went into this pandemics, and I saw tremendous love and care from China to the rest of the world. And even children in the city of Shanghai raised funds for the refugee kids in the Middle East to support them. So I saw lots of challenges in the past 2 years, but it gives me lots of hope that through the collaboration, through technology, and through our human kindness, we'll be able to overcome a lot of challenges.
Michael, Sunil talked earlier about how basically we did not miss a beat. Life went on, work went on, but there have been changes. Expectations of workers have changed. The great resignation is a thing, not just in the US. We saw a resignation of about more than 4 million people left their work. The UK is doing the same thing, those in Canada are doing the same thing. And the recent survey here in Singapore suggested that of all the people that were surveyed, 50% were re-looking at whether they want to stay in their jobs or not. So expectations of workers have changed. Sitting here as a CEO of a company, a huge company, how do you see the issue?
Yes, so the great resignation, the great assessment, or the great reset, I mean, it's all a reality. But if you unpack that a bit, I see it particularly pronounced, not so much in questions as in, I need a new source of energy in my life and I'm rethinking. It is simply in industries that are in great demand, hospitality, healthcare, great stress, a lot of competition for best people. In our industry, anybody who knows anything in AI, digital identity, cyber, hot skills, those are the people that are in demand. And those are the people that are saying, I am feeling huge pressure every day in what I do. Can I do better? Let me look elsewhere. Even if I cannot do better, maybe I can be paid better. So there's a lot of competition going on, and that's been always the case in these industries, now pronounced because the pandemic put a lot of pressure on the system. I think that's the fundamental trend. When you peel the onion a bit more, there's an aspect about people are looking for some source of additional fulfillment. They want to be connected to their passions, make a difference. I'll give you an example. Last year we said, you're all very busy, the Zoom days are a blur. Would you like to do something else beyond? And hands went up across the company as, I want to help on financial inclusion. I want to help on helping small business, etc. So that does play a role, but it's fundamentally competition for hot skills that are under great demand. What do you have to do as an employer? Recognize that. It's a reality. And say, I have targeted compensation plans. I ensure well-being is a thing now because we are seeing a lot of people getting close to burnout because of all of that demand. So it is happening. I think it's going to be something that we will see for a period of time as the recovery from COVID is not going to be near term, so it's going to be with us for a while. And as the private sector, we have to manage through that carefully. But I think there's been good learnings in the last 18 months.
What are you seeing in India? 1 billion people, millions joining the workforce every single year. A great reassessment?
Yeah, for India, livelihoods always were perhaps a little more important. People need work, people have to work. We still have to get wealthy as a nation. But there has been a fundamental shift, and you see it from very close quarters. People, are reassessing their options. My own view is if you were to press everybody to come back to the office, and by the way, I'm in Michael Bloomberg's camp, which says we must work as groups, we must work as teams, we need to get back to the office. But were you to press everybody to come to office, perhaps a very large section of them may not want to come back. Now, is this permanent? Can they afford to stay away from our work stream or just do jobs which can allow them the flexibility? It's hard to predict. The problem is you allow bus or a car to do the 1 hour drive back and forth. It just becomes an unfair situation. Do you create a separate cadre for work from home who have lower increments, who have slower career options compared to those people who make the sacrifice to come to office? This is a conundrum each one of us as chief executives are going to face. And a large part, I would say, is also now people are not used to getting dressed up in the morning and getting ready to work. You have to
special occasion today.
Yeah, you have to shake up the lethargy. You got to get them back. And I can tell you, once you are back in the routine, and I'm checking with people almost daily, in my office, 95% people are back. My operating units is still 50%. But once people have started to come back, they enjoy it. They like it. So my view is everything is assessed at a particular point in time. Eventually, when the world comes back to near normal, it'll never be normal, I think you'll start to see people coming back to work a lot more.
Michael, I'll get back to you. I know you want to add.
Just make a comment on this return to office work question. The concentration is really in white-collar workers who have the choice. The vast majority of people actually don't even have a choice. So it's a question that's discussed with a minority, essentially. And here, I think there's a risk of unintended side consequences. Everything you said, people that can make the sacrifice or not, but just think about the following. What happens once the mute button is pressed? What happens after the meeting? This is when there's impact of careers that are being shaped. And imagine a world where there's, let's say, a lot of women making the decision to work from home so they can support their families better, and men do the other side. You have a perpetuation of lack of gender diversity. Those are some of the intended side consequences we really have to think through. So I'm with you. Back together is better, but we got to do it the right way.
And Jane, when you take a look at China, the young people are pretty disillusioned. They're finding it difficult to find jobs. They're not getting married. Fertility rate at 1.3. What's the sense you're getting there?
Yes, China controlled the virus very well. So last year, in February, we already went back to work full force. Now we are taking the opportunity to evaluate the new hybrid model. So we run A/B testing and pilot program, which enable our employees to have a choice whether work in the office or at home. So far, our testing have shown that the job satisfaction has increased significantly, and productivity is adhered to. So we are very pleased with the result. Different group in different region has shown different favors in terms of where they want to work. Generation Z and millennials prefer to work in the office because they have enjoyed the social environment in the office. Working mothers really have the flexibility to have a hybrid model. So we are still monitoring the process to make sure that our productivity and job satisfaction are enhanced by offering the alternatives to our employees.
Before we touch on technology, I want to just quickly touch on travel. Has it changed? You know, because we had, I think, Tata's Chandrasekaran saying that, you know, he's not going to make that trip halfway around the world to do a 30-minute speech, unless, of course, it is for the New Economy Forum. Sunil, what's your take on that?
I think that perhaps has fundamentally changed. If I look back at my long years in being in business, I'm amazed how I was packing and unpacking all the time. Before you unpack, you have the stress to pack again because you need to move the second or third day to another country, another place. I can't imagine doing that ever again. So when I've been traveling, of course, travel has been relatively less. I go and anchor myself. If I'm going from Delhi to London, I'm there for a long period of time, rather than 2 days, which I used to do earlier and then rush back or go to Africa or go to the US. That has changed. So I would say I would roll in more meetings around that place, do partial virtual and partial physical, and then get back. But who knows? I mean, I'm talking about right now. You know, we may just be back to the old usual self. But I think business travel will suffer from the levels it was before pandemic.
So we have the finger on the pulse. That's just what we do for a living at MasterCard. So we know what people do. Do they do what Sunil does, or do they do something different? And what is shown, as and when travel corridors opened, people did travel. It all started with leisure travel. Everybody wanted.
But is that just pent-up demand?
Yeah, it is. You know, seeing the family and friends again. That is pent-up demand. But the first corridors opened. You're starting to see now at a point is you would have seen everybody. And people still travel. So leisure travel kicks in, as in you're not going home, you're going to the Caribbean. So we've seen actually over the summer. Now business travel, you're starting to see about a 6 months delay on business travel coming back. You know, in conversations that I have with airlines and people who are our customers and partners is all about leisure travel. But as business travel comes back, you start to see customer-facing travel as a reality. Internal travel, not so much. You wouldn't get 300 people in a room somewhere just to talk about your own company. So I think there's moderation. In the end, we'll see business level not coming back to the same level that it was.
Jane definitely has the pulse on the travel industry. Jane, what's your take? I mean, the sense out there, at least according to surveys, is that 50% of business travel will suffer.
Sorry, the translation somehow connects to my line. So, yeah, what we have seen is two trends. The first of all, the trends. Can you hear me okay? Because the translation line is...
We can, Jane, go ahead.
Okay, great. So if it is a one-on-one kind of conversation, it's very easy to be replaced by a Zoom call, so it becomes more efficient without travel. However, to attend a conference like this, I think you will be able to meet a lot of global leaders. The value is still there. So in China, where the business travel is robust, we have seen more than 30% year-over-year growth for our business travelers. So my feeling is when the pandemic is over, there will be a pent-up demand still addressing the business travel. Secondly, with the work at home program, a lot of people will be able to stay on the beach to have a business call. So right now in China, a very popular new word is workcation. Work and vacation integrated. So we're coming up with new products to address these kind of demand.
We learn new words every day. Sunil, this is right up your alley. Let's talk technology. Everything online. It was amazing that the internet didn't crash, right? The thing is, how do you build that technology to ensure that when the next pandemic happens, when there is a crisis, we're able to overcome even better? What needs to be looked into? What needs to be invested into?
Basically, I would say hard infrastructure. You need to ensure that the underlying connectivity network is powerful, has enough capacity, and a great speed and latency to ensure that the traffic that is surging across the globe is well handled. Secondly, we must remember there's a large part of the globe which is still not on internet. And our last calculation suggests we need about $500 billion to cover the rest of the world who are not connected today, largely in the underdeveloped countries, but even places like the US, where FCC has just done an RDOF, Rural Development Opportunity Fund. There are parts of US which don't have internet. There are parts of Canada which don't have internet. So I think that is a simultaneous equation: develop and create more robust connectivity in areas we already are, enhance your network capacities and quality, and go to the areas which are dark. Africa, very large portions of people are still not on internet. So all that requires a lot of work, and that needs 5-7 years. We need to start to work on it now.
And the pandemic has pushed, I guess, technology to a tipping point that has transformed business forever.
Right. It has. It has. It's starting with broadband access. 3.7 billion people don't have access at all. But if you then say, if you assume for a moment there is access, still we've seen a lot of progress and a lot of push throughout the last 18 months on what else needs to happen. Imagine a brave new digital world, and there's all these new people that are starting to use digital solutions that haven't before because they didn't have a choice, they had to, like ordering groceries online. They start to do that. Their question of digital trust is essential because they're not familiar and they don't know how to stay safe. Same for a small business that might have been brick and mortar and just change their approach to have some online delivery proposition and they get hacked. So question of digital trust, investment in cybersecurity, cyber resilience, and cyber-oriented policies is absolutely critical. And I think the real game changer when it comes to where else should be a priority in investment for to put technology to good use to give us that productivity boost that we all want is digital identity. In a world of in a world that is all digital, if you do not have a digital identity, you are a digital have-not. And that is a fundamental problem that has not been solved. It's not been solved consistently. Some countries made real progress. There's a lot of infrastructure in India technology stack. Some countries in the Nordics have progressed that, but it is a gaping hole in this world. And I think that's where we should draw our attention to.
Jane, how are you looking at technology?
Absolutely. It's an enabler during this very challenging time. What
Please welcome to the stage Global Managing Partner of McKinsey & Company, Bob Stunfels.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you. It's my honor to be a fire starter for the next breakout group, New Paradigm for Global Businesses. And as the last discussion session highlighted, the importance of tech for our future is absolutely central, and I fully agree with that. I would offer, though, that to meet the collective challenges, we're going to need more than technology breakthroughs. We're going to need bold and urgent leadership. So for this fire starter, let me tee up three messages. The first message is the stakes are incredibly high. The stakes are incredibly high. And as we look forward over the course of this decade, we're at a crossroads, and I could paint two very different scenarios for how this decade could play out. The first, a new age of prosperity. GDP could grow 30 to 50% over this decade, with a better quality of life for most people, a more sustainable future for our planet. True, sustainable, inclusive growth, one path. Second path doesn't look so good. It has tepid economic recovery, only 10 to 20% increase in GDP growth, less equitable distribution, less sustainable, with worse outcomes for global health and the environment. Two radically different paths. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Let me give a few specifics to this. If you consider climate, if we don't improve the net zero commitments that we've all made, substantially improve, we'll have 1 billion people living in lethal heat by 2050. 1 billion people. If we think about inequality, 7 of 10 people today live in societies with growing inequality. And we've seen the massive stress that places on both public and private institutions. And in terms of economic growth, the bookend scenarios have never been wider than they are today as we forecast what could be. So the stakes are high. Now, the second message, however, is we can do this. We can live into the first scenario. At McKinsey, we've done some modeling and believe that we could have 3 to 4% per annum GDP growth over this decade from existing technologies. Similarly, those same technologies, if we look at Europe in particular, could abate 85% of the carbon today. 85% in Europe from existing technologies. And if you look at job creation, there is a scenario with substantial net job growth over this decade. It requires investment in sectors from infrastructure, healthcare, to energy. But done right, job growth can outstrip jobs dislocated through technology 2 to 1, but it requires the right focus on upskilling. And the goals of sustainability, inclusion, and growth can also reinforce each other and create a virtuous circle. Let me give some specifics. More inclusive healthcare could add 0.5 point to global GDP growth by 2040. Advancing women's economic potential in the workforce could add 13 trillion to global GDP growth. And growth rates for sustainable products and markets outstrip conventional ones 10 to 20% in all categories. Now, I'm not naive. Driving all three, sustainability, inclusion, and growth, won't be easy, and there's some real tensions that need to be addressed. As technology is implemented at an ever faster rate, 100 million people will need to reskilled this decade. 100 million people. And energy transitions, if we don't focus, will be regressive. They will be regressive. If I take the US alone, 60% of low-income households face severe energy burdens, meaning they spend over 10% of total household income on energy. Just transitions have to be a crucial component as we think about climate transition. And I think we all know as business leaders, it's not easy. 40% of our workforce right now wants to change jobs in the next 6 months. The regulatory environment is increasingly uncertain. And we have multiple stakeholder management to lean forward if we want to be bolder. All these things come together. But I'd argue it is a time for us as leaders to embrace long-term capital and to be courageous. Which brings me to my last message. We need to work together, and we need to move quickly. In reaching for sustainable inclusive growth, we have to work across the public-private divide, as Mike said in his opening. It's the only way we'll find solutions to things like standards for climate, for a mechanism that creates real incentive to invest in human capital, and for a framework that allows us R&D investments to accelerate over this decade to solve some of these toughest problems. We also have to move quickly. One thing that COVID has shown is that enterprise can move faster than any of us expected, which is good news because these problems aren't going to be the problems of the next generation. They're going to be the problems of our leadership generation. So the question I have is, can we lock in this COVID speed to solve these particular issues? So the choice is ours. We have a moment right now to drive sustainable, inclusive growth. That won't be easy, but I'd argue we should accept nothing less. And as we go to this next panel, the question I'd ask each of you is, are we being bold enough as leaders as we plot our course? Thank you.
IFP, test, test, test. IFP, test, test, test.
Please welcome a moderator, editor-at-large of Bloomberg Television, Eric Shetzka, and his panelists, President of the New York Stock Exchange Group, Stacey Cunningham, CEO of DBS Group, Piyush Gupta, Managing Director and Vice Chairman of PIMCO, John Staszynski, and Chairman of UBS Group, Axel Araba.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with my lively and highly engaged panel and to see you here this morning. Before we begin, I do want to remind you that you have the app. You've been using them already to answer the panels, answer the polls, but you can also use them to send questions for the panel. And I'll be looking for your questions as they come in, and I'll try to weave them into our conversation. So please engage with me, engage with the panel, and we'll make it collaborative. We have a great question to answer today. It is a question that every CEO, every CIO, and every boardroom around the world should be asking itself. Is there a new paradigm for global business? We have a pretty good idea of what the old paradigm was. We could call it globalization. And that paradigm had some highly identifiable characteristics. Free movement of capital, for example, trade liberalization, supply chain expansion, cross-border interdependence and multilateralism, also resource exploitation, wage stagnation to a degree, institutional authority. It sure feels to me, and I think to others here, that that paradigm has changed awfully fast. I would point to, among other things, inflation, ESG, and crypto as evidence that something is happening. So I'd like to begin by asking our panel, do you believe that there is a new paradigm for global business? If so, what are its dominant characteristics? Are they different from the old ones, and if so, how? And if there isn't a new paradigm for global business, why not? Stacey, I'd like you to start the conversation.
Well, there's definitely a new paradigm for global business, and I'm not sure that any one of us up here can tell you exactly what that's going to look like just yet, because there are so many unknowns, and there are so many things happening at the same time, and their interaction is really what is going to decide and determine what the future of business looks like. And so many of the topics that Eric mentioned are related to that and woven into that, but it's other things as well, and some of them are driven by the consumer wanting a more direct impact on their choices, employees wanting a more direct impact on how they decide and what they want to do, what flexibility they want, the wages, where they're working, what industries they're in. I mean, there's so many things happening at the same time, with also looking at the deglobalization of so many industries. So it's definitely going to change, but I'm not smart enough to tell you what it's going to look like.
Who is?
Well, Eric, I think we've also now, first of all, I think we've seen the dots, but we haven't, it's going to take us quite a few years to be able to connect the dots to see what the new paradigm looks like. I do think, though, following on Tracy's comment about the individual, I think one of the things, this whole debate about climate reaction, COVID is really the first major sustainability crisis, and it's game-changing. But I think that also reintroduces this whole discussion of the common good. Mm-hmm. And I think the expression of the common good is something we're very conscious of, but it varies culturally, and it's something that the Americans talk about, and it's obviously something now the Chinese very much talk about in the context of common prosperity and the recent plenum. So I think we need to add, to Stacey's point, the individual and this sort of me orientation, particularly and very much in the American economy, to the notion of the common good and how the new business model is going to address the common good.
Eric, if I can come in. So first of all, I'm not in the camp of the world is deglobalizing, and maybe we'll talk about that separately. But I have two messages. First is, I don't think there's just a new paradigm for global business. I think there's a new paradigm for how we run the world. And that's a lot more consequential than how you run business. I think there are two big drivers which we need to be really cognizant of. One is we're trying to wean away from a fossil fuel, carbon-led economy, something we've created over the last 150 years, and very rapidly swing to a completely new economic construct. There's trillions and trillions of dollars of extant infrastructure investment which needs to be transitioned. That's no small feat. The second is, people haven't talked about it so much, Wang Qishan mentioned it. I think the impact of technology in the next decade is going to be completely game-changing. That includes Web3 with self-sovereign individuals and self-sovereign identities. It includes AI with artificial general intelligence increasingly allowing us to outsource our brains. And it includes a 5G world where holographic and 3D, etc., make virtual reality possible. I think when you couple this, these two pedals, I think the green pedal and the technology pedal, one consequence of this is going to be massive social redistribution. So the poor people, the poor countries, the lesser developed countries will face the brunt of this transition more than better people. And that is going to create a lot of social unrest. So in that context, I think that's my second message. We have to rethink how we run the world, and that has two, three big dimensions. One is role of governments. I think you will increasingly get to a world where you have to have a lot more activist role of the public sector. That doesn't necessarily mean big government, but it does mean more activist government, because some of the questions we're going to deal with are questions of what makes us human, what makes us philosophically, the question of philosophy. And you need people to help shepherd a common state for society and direction. That's activist government. I think you need government to catalyze investments. You need government to de-risk investments. That's an activist government. By the way, this is not the first time it's happened. You know, it's happened in the 18th century. In the fiscal sense, it happened with Japan post-World War. It happened with DARPA and NASA driving Silicon Valley in the US. And frankly, I've seen it in Singapore. Singapore is the best case point, activist government. But I think you also need a private sector which is a little bit more attuned to what's popularly now called stakeholder capitalism, i.e. a common good agenda, not just a shareholder good agenda. So I think you'll need that to come together. And I think the PPP will be public, private, and people, because the capacity of the usual to have a voice with social media in the new world means the people sector is going to be a relevant sector. One thing I think we need to take away from this when I say manage the world, our current global multilateral institutions are failing us. We will have to come together as one people, and therefore I can see, again, Wang Qishan, a completely new infrastructure and architecture for managing the digital world and the digital economy at a global level, the United Nations for digital. But also I see maybe dialing up within the current infrastructure a new impetus for the green economy and the green world. So I think there are a lot of shifts we need to see in the coming decade.
Well, if I just, I think every time we are in a crisis, people say, this time it's different, and every time we come out of a crisis, one of the strongest features we find in mankind is habit persistence. We go back to our old ways. So I'm much more on the page that, yes, we are in a crisis. Crises usually are best managed by governments because they have unlimited resources and can act fast, and they can actually enforce things. So that's why we created states. That's why we created governments. And governments do their job in a crisis. I mean, see Hank in the room. Governments did their job in the financial crisis. Governments will do their job in the pandemic crisis. We had repeated crises in finance. That's why we created a financial crisis infrastructure at the global level with the IMF, the World Bank. We didn't have that in the pandemic world. And we're now moving from pandemic to endemic. We have to start living with viruses globally. And we need to create a kind of infrastructure there. The WTO existed, but it wasn't a global coordinator, and the responses were fragmented, national, even regional. And we locked down systems, we locked down towns. That's not a good response, and I think we need to move to a better place in response. But I think the way we will do business will be influenced by other things than the pandemic. The pandemic has sort of shown us that we're vulnerable on globalization, because now every crisis we had is global by definition. And there will be other global crises. One of the crises that is in the back is the sort of environmental crisis. But I'm a stern believer that through research, development, but also to determined efforts, we get on top of these. So the mega trends that we're seeing that Piyush mentioned, digitalization, the whole sustainability discussion, those will be parts of doing business. They're not external events that influence business. They are part of how we do business, and it has to be put in our business models. And I think that's how we will change, but that's adaptation to the circumstance. And I think that's what mankind has really done all the time. I don't think we're in a new normal. We're just coming out of a really bad situation, and we'll learn our lessons from that and be better in the future.
Axel, I completely agree with you that the government played such a critical role in crisis and is so necessary, and we saw swift action back in spring of 2020. But the private sector did too, and we wouldn't be sitting here together if we weren't all vaccinated and businesses didn't rise to the challenge of heroics to develop vaccines. We saw so many businesses over the past 18 months looking for ways to solve problems, whether they be about sustainability and ESG, or, and from my seat at the New York Stock Exchange, we're seeing companies coming public all the time, many of them providing technologies to address issues that they recognize, whether it be supporting small and mid-sized businesses, or I see Sarah Fryer out there next door developing communities, because community is such an important part of our recovery. And so all of those things that the private sector is doing are so critical, yet there's such an adversarial relationship between the public sector and the private sector.
No, it's no contradiction, because what you see is in a situation where you are in a crisis, the government can play a role by coordinating and by intervening. It's as important when you come out of the crisis that the government retreats, that the government lets markets and corporates take over again. We've seen that in the financial crisis. There was a re-regulation, but now the financial industry is actually much stronger than we were before the crisis. So it's a give and take. The government plays a role in a crisis, but if they stay in crisis mode all the time, we're really moving down the wrong track. I agree with you.
I think one thing I wanted to bridge this conversation, I think actually it really depends what country and culture you're in. If you go to Europe, the governments have a much more engaged role in running the society. If you go to America, for example, where it's become a very, the new political agenda is so short-termist in America that the people who are assuming a much bigger role in the society are the very big corporations. And one of the things that's interesting, Stacey, is who are the people that are having the biggest impact on climate and during the vaccine movement? It's actually the employees of the big companies and the pension fund holders of the big companies, because every day the CEO now in the last 2 or 3 years has has to deal with activist groups internally. So these groups are having big influence on issues of climate, brown to green, big influence on vaccines, big influence on how the pandemic is managed, and big influence on lifestyle. So I think it varies. And then you go to Asia, where you have a very different dynamic between the governments and the corporations. So I think you can't really generalize. The thing we can't forget, though, and I want to keep this reintroducing the individual here, we have the governments, this whole climate debate.
Eric, you have
we have the governments and we have corporations. You don't hear enough about what the average person who doesn't want to get left behind, where's that person going to be in terms of getting retrained with digital to all the things that you've been raised?
We have a question here that pertains to what we've already discussed, and I'm going to pose it to the panel. Can we rely on companies to protect the common good through ESG and voluntary compliance, or do we need to ask government to use the mandatory levers of taxes and regulation to accomplish that? Piyush, you were about to say something, so I'm going to throw this to you.
Well, I think the answer is yes and yes. I think without a doubt, the business agenda and company's agenda is morphing, if it wasn't already there. So the round table, the business leaders round table in the US is a case in point. But increasingly, the understanding of having to respond to multiple stakeholders is there on companies, the pension funds, our investors, the NGOs, marketplace, our consumers, our employees. They're expecting it of us, so you don't have a choice. But by the way, I also have come to this thing that if you think long term, then there really is not that much conflict between your shareholder commitments and other stakeholder commitments. I mean, if you want to give a decent return to your shareholder over 30 years, you'd better be around for 30 years. And the only way you're around for 30 years is you need a license from civil society. So you've got to earn that license. But at the same time, there are other things where it's quite clear to me the public sector is the only way you get to play a role. You want a global tax on carbon. I can tell you no private sector company can create a tax on carbon. You need the government to do that. You need rules around measurements. You need rules around transition pathways. If you don't have an activist public sector role, this will never happen. So as with everything else, we saw that in the financial sector, the GFC. You can leave the market forces completely to themselves, and then it turns out that's inadequate. You need to have stronger, regulations, supervision frameworks. So I think that balance is what you need, and that's why yes and yes. I want to quickly go back, Eric, to this earlier point. I think John was saying this thing right. I think some of the responses of, do you need active government only in a crisis, or do you need active government all the time, is a socio-political issue.
I'm going to come back
to Asia, most parts of where we are, it has been an activist government, and maybe we can talk about it. I think Singapore is a small country, 5 million people, but it's a fantastic example for what an activist government can do through cycle, not just in crisis.
I do actually want to come back to that point, but because we're eager to engage the audience, I want to talk about this. I referred to the old paradigm. I gave it a name, globalization, before, but it had a supportive environment, right, of subdued market volatility when we didn't have a financial crisis on our hands, political stability, and of course, low inflation. We have a poll, and I'll bring it up so that you can see it, folks. This is the question: are central banks underestimating inflation? Answer A, yes, there's too much government spending, monetary stimulus. B, absolutely, it's structural, and we're heading for stagflation. C, no, inflation is a temporary phenomenon linked to supply shocks and worker shortages. So let's give the audience a chance to answer that question. And as they do, panel, how would you have answered the question, Stacey?
I would go with C, but temporary is a subjective term.
Would you prefer transitory?
Well, it's just hard to say exactly how long that'll last.
Piyush.
I don't agree. So I think inflation is getting to be a lot more structural for 2 or 3, the 2 or 3 anecdotal observations. One is a lot of inflation is now wage inflation. I'm seeing wages go up everywhere, not just in the US, but in our part of the world. I was mentioning before, I announced in December that there'd be no wage increases in my company this year. That pronouncement lasted 100 days. I started losing people. We had to, and most of my clients are doing that. So, and wage inflation is sticky. It doesn't go away. Second, the energy issues. As we're trying to disinvest in the fossil fuel economy and shifting, I think there's a structural shift which is going to drive energy price inflation. And on the supply chain, all our clients I talk to at the ports, at the ships and so on, I don't think the supply chain is a 1, 2, 3, 4 month issue. It could be 2, 3, 4 quarters. And what happens is when you start seeing sticker prices of 6 and 7%, that starts building inflationary expectations. And once inflationary expectations get anchored, then you get into the spiral. So I don't think it's such a temporary phenomenon.
John, how would you answer?
Let's remember, inflation's at a 31-year high, at least the data that came out of the United States. It's clearly going to remain high for the foreseeable future. So there's two issues. There's one, where is it ultimately going to remain when it does come into some new paradigm normalization? I think this global argy-bargy in terms of supply chains, people reestablishing their models, and the sort of deglobalization is going to continue for several years, probably 3 to 5 years. So it's going to be a period of time where inflation is going to be very volatile. So the issue isn't inflation is going to remain high. The issue is where it's going to reset. Will it reset around 2%, which has been the Fed target, or higher than that? So that's what we should be focusing on.
Axel?
Combination of A and B, except for B, I don't believe we had for stagflation. I think we'll see continued growth. We're going up to our old growth trajectories, but in my view, there is some structural elements that are not just transitory or temporary. And I think we'll have uncomfortably high rates of inflation for, 1, 2, 3 years like that. Then it really depends on policy, because if you assume, as in A, that monetary policy and government spending remains extremely expansionary, then I think we get more structural problems that we run into. But if they do their job and normalize policies and normalize spending coming out of the crisis, move to a more normal mode of operation, it can be more short-lived. But I think it really depends on how these levers are moved in the next years.
I'm not sure if we have the results of our poll. I'm sure they'll come up in a moment, and we'll be able to see how all of you in this room, here we go. Do you agree with our panel? Well, our panel had mixed views, and so do you. There we go. Again, I'm going to make reference to the old paradigm. We could call it the old global business model, and make an assertion that it was guided by a singular goal, profit. And there's something of a consensus emerging today that the pursuit of profit not only isn't enough, but also explains why the old business model is variously destroying the planet, creating ever larger wealth gaps, and not delivering on the promise of shared prosperity. Axel, even if you don't agree that there will be a new paradigm, does there need to be a new sense of purpose for the global business?
I think global business needs to really focus on not creating externalities like pollution and global warming. And so clearly the cost of doing business globally in bringing that back to levels that are sustainable will have a much increased cost level. So I'm with Piyush, there will be a lot of green inflation in a lot of things we do, and it will hit consumers, and it will also, just a stark reminder, we're talking about distribution and whether there's inequality in our societies. It's not a new phenomenon. Remember, the Communist Party just had its 100th anniversary in China. Marx and Lenin have been 100 years ago transforming political views in Europe. So everything repeats. It just comes back in shorter or longer cycles. So I'm not that excited about it. We'll get on top of these problems. So I don't think we're in a new world. We just see a morphing of the old world into something that looks different, but it's the same underlying thing.
I sort of think we have to keep in mind, this is, I think, the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's sort of definition of the purpose of the corporation and maximizing profit. If you actually read that article carefully, its purpose of the corporation is to maximize profit, comma, all things considered, which gets into this logic that Axel's referring to in terms of what I call stakeholder capitalism, which means the broader purview. And I think we're now living in an environment where people are, and you see this now with the recent Chinese plenum, and you also see this with the big American corporations. They're more focused not on maximizing profit, but what I call stable growth. And stable growth doesn't imply volatility in growth. It implies managed growth over a period of time because they're looking at more long-term R&D, and they've got a number of objectives. So I think you're seeing a shift from more volatile growth to more projected stable growth in the developed world, but also, and that's one of the things the Chinese are equally focused on.
There's a relevant question from the audience here. Given the impressive job done by the private sector, you mentioned this, Stacey, to develop vaccines in record time, given that it required public investment and facilitation, do we also need an Operation Warp Speed to rapidly develop new technologies to address the climate crisis?
Well, it didn't all require public investment. I mean, Pfizer made that decision on themselves, right? So I think that there is that opportunity. I do believe, though, that there is a place for the government to work together with the private sector in a constructive way, less adversarial, so we can advance those initiatives. And I think it's really important. And when we think about, I just lost my train of thought. I'll let you go.
Well, let me pick up on that. I think R&D is important, and oftentimes, in the pharma industry, the private sector does R&D. You take the internet, a large part of that was driven by DARPA, and the Defense Administration, and then poured out. So there's some areas where R&D, as an example, the public sector can play a critical role. In Singapore, we have an agency called A-STAR. We have an R&D budget of about $22 billion for every 5-year period. And we, along with participants from private sector, figure where to put those dollars to work. And a substantial amount of it is now going in things about, how do you think about nature-based solutions, greening the economy, creating institutes of learning, driving the education agenda on some of these subjects. So I think the public sector can play a role.
And they're not in conflict. It can be a commercial opportunity, and to be focused on profit, and to be focused on long-term growth and stable growth. And that's the environment I believe we should be fostering. When I think about some of the decisions we've made in our own business, just looking back through time, in 2003, we're investing in environmental markets with the climate exchange that we acquired in 2010 because we thought the importance of that work, and also the commercial opportunities that we predicted we were going to see from that. Same logic when we announced our launch of natural asset companies, which provides an opportunity for investors to invest in the natural resources that we want to see become nature positive, so that we can have a positive influence. That's a commercial opportunity. It's also a successful endeavor for all of us and mankind, and I believe strongly we should be fostering those projects.
One of the things, Eric, I think we've got to be, and following on what Stacey has said, is the whole ESG area has been managed with a PR point of view as being very negative. Everything is what I call negative ESG, negative climates. Everything is, you can't, obviously, you've got to constrain coal, you've got to constrain carbon, you've got to constrain methane. But let's be on the offensive side. There's an extraordinary number of industries, the green industries, which are not given enough attention. They're not given enough profile. Many of them are not in America, which is probably why they're not given enough profile. Many of them are in Europe or in Asia, and particularly in China, where there's a big growing business. So I think we need to figure out broader policies to make sure that these companies are given, Stacey, more profile, more capital, more opportunities to expand, and really set aside and given incentives, tax incentives or other incentives, more than what we have now in order to grow. Because this is going to take, the Industrial Revolution took a long time. This is going to take a long time, and we've got to transition this. This isn't about turning off hydrocarbons, turning this on, because this is still very nascent. We need to but we need to focus on the positive side of where the investment needs to be.
Actually, and part of that investment actually is on what you said, John. It is the transition.
Yeah.
You've got to get industries to move from brown to light brown to light green, and light green to green. It's not going to go one to the other. So it is a $1 trillion opportunity, absolutely.
Piyush, you started your comments in this conversation talking about how we run the world and the need for activist governments. The rise of crypto embodies a mistrust of institutions, especially monetary institutions and governments, and it embodies the collective desire for a decentralization of financial power. How, in the context of this conversation, do you think about decentralization and tools like cryptocurrency?
Well, that's the challenge I alluded to. So, maybe not in this room, but if you talk to any young kid today, you talk to the technocrats, you talk to the evangelists, they will tell you that the future of the world is self-sovereign. 8 billion people, each of us can be sovereign. We have our own identity, it is tokenized, my data is my own, my interactions are I will deal in smart contracts, I will have my own currency. So in Web 2.0, the big risk was due debate between the kingdom of Facebook versus the kingdom of Sweden. In Web 3.0, it's not even that. Is it due each become a self-sovereign entity and work with that? And believe me, there's hundreds of millions of people who think that's the future. And which is why I say it's a massive paradigm shift. We're good to think, no, I don't believe that will happen. I think there is a lot vested in cultural identities, nation states, what we've built, the Westphalian democracy. So I don't think it will happen. But it will require us to think very hard on how do we construct a system where a large number of people think, I don't need a government, I don't need a currency, I don't need a fiat currency, I don't need a bank, I don't need a central bank, I don't need a stock exchange. So how do you balance these two and create the artifacts that you need to run the world in the future? Is the right question.
Axel, I want you to jump in here. You've run institutions on the public and the private side. What do you think?
Well, look, you asked about crypto. It's a hybrid, and people usually talk about the hybrid instead of the details. We really like the technology behind that, blockchain technology, distributed ledger, and we do a lot of that trade finance as banks with that. The crypto part is where I'm skeptical, because the whole idea is let's sort of move payments from banks and cash to something that is an anonymous vehicle where both sides of the transactions are not known. That will not survive. The only part where you had that in the old paradigm was banknotes. Governments have phased out large denomination banknotes because they didn't want large transactions with no fingerprint and no ID on it. And crypto, trying to do that in digital, is going to be jumped upon by government as much in the traditional world was as it will be in the sort of digital world. So I love the technology. I think the idea of having instantaneous transaction between a large number of people, fantastic, but I think it needs to have a KYC, know your client, an AML procedure around it, otherwise it will not survive. Governments are working hard to avoid illegal activities that could be done through transaction in financial sphere, and governments will not tolerate this to become really big.
The regulation will definitely follow, and governments are definitely going to get involved. The revolution that drove crypto, I think, gets to John's point about the individuals saying, hey, the system doesn't work for me. They feel left out. And that decentralization, if we don't address those underlying themes of individuals not feeling part of the framework that we've created, we're going to see that conflict continue.
Whether we define it as a new paradigm or an evolution of the old paradigm, I think you all have a much better sense of what the world we're living in today looks like, and more importantly, what it's going to look like in the days, the weeks, the months, and years ahead. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Our program will begin in 5 minutes. Please make your way to your seat. Please take your seats. Our program will begin shortly. Please welcome to the stage Bloomberg Editor-in-Chief John Micklethwaite.
Hello, it's my great pleasure to welcome, hopefully on a screen in front of me here, Henry Kissinger, to ask him questions on your behalf. So hopefully Henry is going to appear.
Make it a little louder.
I can hear your voice, Henry. Welcome to the New Economy Forum. Thank you again for talking to us. I know how much you tried to get here. I was going to begin by asking you about the last physical meeting that we had at the New Economy Forum in 2019. You warned us about being in the foothills of a new Cold War with China. And then in the last virtual version of this, you told me that you thought we had reached the high mountain passes. That was back in the days of Donald Trump. Since then, of course, we have had the Biden presidency, and I think it would be fair to say that the first period of the Biden presidency was one of increased tensions with China. But over the past week, we have seen, in a sense, a kind of come down the mountain. We had the deal to do with climate at COP, and now we've had this conversation between President Xi and President Biden, which, as Wang Qishan said earlier, was there were common understandings. And I suppose my first question for you is, are we beginning to come down the mountain, or do you still see this as a relationship heading in the wrong direction?
I'd say we are through the mountain pass on a precipice from which you can look in both directions. And now it depends which direction is chosen.
Being on the edge of a precipice is never normally a good start, but all the same, on the necessary conditions for us to start coming down the mountain, so to speak, what do you think America needs to do? What does Joe Biden need to do to help change this relationship if he wants to do that?
I think both sides have to adapt the view that a conflict between major technical powers of comparable capacities must not occur for the preservation of humanity. And they therefore have to decide that they will attempt to compose their differences to a level in which coexistence becomes not only possible, but essential. I think the conversations this weekend, last few days, were a good beginning of the statement of a possible mood. They now have to be followed by concrete discussions that lead in the direction both presidents have affirmed they want to pursue.
Where do you see America in that? Just to push you on that, do you think that America is committed to a better relationship with China, or do you think it still sees it as a strategic rival? What is your impression of the Biden administration?
It is inherent, it's inherent in the technology and economy of each side that countries will consider each other as competitors. And public opinion in the United States has moved into the direction of looking at China as a rival. The necessity for both sides is to see whether from that posture they can move towards a pattern in which disputes are attempted to be mitigated and in which they realize that a victor is not possible without a risk of destroying humanity.
On that particular thing, are there particular areas that you would want to see America, and for that matter China, concentrating on? We have seen the progress on climate, but are there other areas, other opportunities that you can see where there is room for cooperation?
Well, there has been some progress made on climate change, and there is a whole range of technical issues in which cooperation between the two sides could bring benefit. And there are also tensions in the world in which cooperation between China and the United States, say on nuclear proliferation, is of the greatest importance. So there are many topics which it is at least important to begin to see whether the views of the two sides are sufficiently compatible to permit cooperation, and if that is not possible, how to prevent them from moving towards conflict.
Are you convinced about China's good intentions in this? I mean, if you talk to a lot of people in the United States, or indeed in the West, they will say that China is bent on becoming a bigger power, and that America and other things are in its way. It wants to go its own way. It is merely biding its time. Do you see the current Chinese regime, which you know well, do you see that as one which does want that degree of cooperation that you've just spoken about?
My task as a student of foreign policy is not primarily to psychoanalyze the Chinese regime. I assume that Chinese leaders will work towards the maximum capability of their country. our task as Americans and non-Chinese is to understand what we need to do to make sure that there is at least equivalence and in no case subordination. If we understand that, and if the Chinese understand their interests, as I believe they are very capable of, then it should be possible to make arrangements by which the level of competition is reduced to a point that makes even cooperative measures possible. I'm assuming that China will operate at a high level of its capacities, because that is the Confucian tradition and that is inherent in Chinese history. It is our obligation to work at an equivalent level of capacity and then to ask ourselves whether the world will not be better off if we deal with the outstanding issues like climate change, like artificial intelligence, like economic relationships, from the point of view that leads to benefit for both sides.
I would imagine that after 60, 70 years, you might have graduated from a student to at least an undergraduate in analyzing the Chinese administration. But I wondered, what role is there in this for Europe? I mean, it's interesting in this debate here, it's a word one barely hears mentioned, yet it is still, the European Union is still the world's biggest economy. What role does Europe have in this geopolitics?
For my generation of American thinkers, the relationship with Europe has been a central feature of American foreign policy. And the Atlantic Partnership is of crucial importance. But the problems of the Atlantic Partnership when it was formed had to do, on the whole, with Russian challenges. Now, the Chinese challenges are of a different cultural and substantive nature than the ones that were posed by the Europeans, by Europe. So we cannot automatically apply all the lessons of Europe to the conditions of Asia. But I would expect that in a general sense, Europe would look at America's problems in other parts of the world with sympathy and with understanding, and that we in turn will understand that on some specific issues, the Europeans, because of different geography, history, and economy, might have special concerns, but the overall lines of policy should be that Europe and the United States cooperate with allowances for special conditions that may exist by country or region.
Can I ask you about one thing which I know has obsessed you over the past couple of years? Artificial intelligence. You have a book on it, The Age of AI, and it is a large part of the competition between China and America. In your book, you describe AI as the biggest change in human thinking since the Enlightenment. Given that importance, how do you see the contest between US and China in terms of artificial intelligence?
Well, first of all, artificial intelligence is a departure in human thinking comparable to that which produced the Enlightenment. So a whole new school of intellectual evolution is bound to develop when the results are achieved by achieving a result without exactly knowing what the reason for it is, but knowing that it is produced by an algorithmic understanding of events. That is a huge change in human thinking. Now, China has the same challenge, how to adjust its thinking to this reality. Now, if we deal with this entirely in entirely competitive terms, and if we try to determine who is superior, and if we don't even know how to define a level, what a level of superiority is, which is strategically useful, we could be engaging in a race which, as a result of accidents, leads to consequences which we cannot foresee. So I would hope that a way will be found by which technological discussions between the two sides take place, which permit also an adjustment of economic competition. Neither side will accept a permanently inferior standing, but both sides have to understand that the other will not concede a permanently superior standing. So a dialogue that starts from these realities is essential. And there can be no winners in an AI race if both sides do what they need to do.
Can I push you on one particular last thing to do with that? You mentioned nuclear conflict before. You were involved, obviously, in the talks with the Soviet Union about that. In your book and in conversation, you have made the point that cyber warfare is completely different because, firstly, it is harder for people to say exactly what they have because often that is giving away competitive advantage. But also the bigger idea that we now have computers which, in order to fight each other, should operate almost without human control. Is there a kind of organization or a governing principle that America and China should join in on this? Is there a way in which you could have a modern version of disarmament?
Well, the logic of cyber warfare is to operate at a speed which is beyond human capacity. And therefore, the temptation is to build automatic responses into weapon systems. But if you deprive these issues of any human element, then the danger
Check. This is Esther on IFD.
Systems might make a judgment which you didn't foresee, and the danger of an automatic conflict creation become very great. So how to build human judgment into cyber confrontations, and how to solve the problem that these types of weapons are usually kept very secret within each country. So to expose them to discussion with a foreign country is not a matter that has been ever done before, but without it, it will not be possible to achieve meaningful restraints. But these attempts to achieve restraints must not become a way of intelligence exploitation so much as a way of, or at all, but as a way of looking at a novel elemental change in human cognition, which is now imposed on us to deal with. And a few hundred years ago, the German philosopher Kant predicted that peace would be achieved at some point in human history, either by human insight or by catastrophes of a magnitude that will permit no other choice. We are at exactly that point in our conduct, and the responsibility of our leaders is to try to fulfill it. And I must say, I think the dialogue has begun on an appropriate level, appropriate to the challenge.
And just thank you very much for talking to us. You put us on a precipice and you ended up with Immanuel Kant. But thank you very much, and thank you very much also for being our co-chairman. You are much missed. Thank you for staying up late to do this, and we will see you next year. Thank you.
Please welcome our moderator, Bloomberg Television anchor Sherry Ann, and her panelists, Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania, His Excellency Dr. Philip Isdor Mpango, CEO and founder of Aza Finance, Elizabeth Rosiello, President and CEO of PayPal, Dan Schulman, and Senior Minister of the Republic of Singapore, Tharman Shanmugaratnam.
Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us today. The title of this session is The Two-Speed Global Recovery, the Dangers of a Widening Rich-Poor Gap. Of course, for the past few decades, we have seen the global economy converge, with lower income countries catching up to wealthier ones thanks to capital, the advance of technology. But it seems the pandemic has reversed that trend. So we are now seeing the IMF warn of a dangerous divergence. We are seeing, of course, this being exacerbated by the great vaccine divide. More than 90% of populations in lower income countries are still unvaccinated. So this panel will try to tackle those issues, to see where we're at in the state of the global recovery, and of course how we can heal really the biggest scars of the pandemic and try to ensure an equitable recovery. We have an amazing lineup of guests. Thank you very much for joining us today. First of all, His Excellency Dr. Philip Isdor Mpango, Vice President of the United Republic of Tanzania. Elizabeth Rosiello, who's the CEO and founder of Aza Finance. Also Dan Schulman, President and CEO of PayPal. And of course, Tharman Shanmugaratnam, Senior Minister and Chairman of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Welcome to you all, and thank you very much for being here with us. Let's start with the state of the global recovery, because as I mentioned, we have seen this rich and poor divide just become more persistent during the pandemic, become more evident. Let me start with you, Mr. Vice President. What are you seeing in terms of the global economic recovery and the inequalities that we're seeing within nations, within Tanzania, around the world, among nations as well?
Well, first, thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is a great chance for us in sub-Saharan Africa to share with the world the experiences we are having with the pandemic. Well, first, what we see is a very sluggish recovery, but very uneven. And it is sluggish, particularly for countries like Tanzania, where, to start with, we had very weak public health systems. And therefore, we really took a hard knock, having to struggle with very nascent health facilities. We had to convert even theaters at some point to be able to accommodate health patients, people that succumbed to the pandemic. We had to really struggle with related facilities. Oxygen, for example. My own country has only one oxygen plant in the whole country of 60 million people. And therefore, you can guess the consequences of having to struggle with over 150,000 patients. But also, the unevenness comes because some families lost their loved ones. And in that case, when you lose bread earners, you know the consequences. You throw the entire family in poverty. I can cite an example where a family in 3 days lost the head of the household and the mother of the household, and both professors. So we have really lost out. But apart from the health sector effects, we have had a serious knock on the economy and the financial sector. And here, tourism, for example,
right.
As the borders closed, we did not receive tourists. No airlines were coming. So tourist operators shut down, jobs were lost, and same for trade. International trade collapsed. We could not import the necessary raw materials from our major trading partners, China, India, and the like.
Really, this pandemic has been a very tragic one for everyone.
Indeed, very, very tragic. And I think really key here is that we ask the advanced world not to forget sub-Saharan Africa. Because the challenge that we see is that while the advanced economies are recovering relatively faster because they have the vaccines, we don't have the vaccines. The facilities that have been availed to us, they're just too little. And the pandemic is global.
On that note, let me ask Minister Tharman about your thoughts on how much have high-income economies done so far faced with this crisis and this divergence that the Vice President is talking about?
Well, I think the divergence that we know in a very sharp sense is the divergence in vaccine access. That's well known. But I think underpinning it is now a gulf that's opened up in trust between the developing world and the advanced world. a gulf in trust that's opening up even within societies. Some societies have come out okay. In fact, there's some societies where trust seems to be even stronger than it was before COVID, because people found a way of collaborating with each other for the common good. But there are many other societies where divisions are just sharper than they used to be. And we see that in the news every day. And trust in institutions across the world is now lower than it was 2 years ago. It was already weakening for some years, and it's much lower than it used to be. Trust in some governments has held up. Trust in many governments is now weaker than it's ever been. And trust in multilateralism is at an all-time low on all the issues to do with the common good.
Right.
Trust in multilateralism, or even plurilateralism, the G20 and other groupings, trust is lower than it used to be. And we have to be concerned about that, and it means addressing it not just through narratives, not just through saying the right things. We need concrete collaborative ventures, whether it's on climate change or making sure that we can scale up vaccine production and distribution, or critically, looking beyond COVID, addressing the issues that existed before COVID and are now much more accentuated. We have a crisis in learning. The biggest divide in the world, by the way, by far, the most profound and the most dangerous divide we have is in learning opportunities.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on the ground, because of course, Elizabeth, you cater to frontier markets. What are you seeing?
So I would say hope is not all lost. It's true, there's been 6 million vaccinations in Nigeria, which is a population of 206 million. That's clear. But the entrepreneurial resilience of the African continent, where I've been running this business for 8 years, is unmatched and unparalleled. And it was during COVID that we saw the rise of the first African unicorns. And there are now 7 unicorns on the continent after a decade of being almost 0. And all of those are in digital businesses. And amongst my peers on the continent, we're used to, epidemics, the election violence. We've closed our offices in Nairobi, in Lagos, and Dakar 10, 12 times over the last 8 years. So we already had a work from home strategy. Our employees were already completely set up. You can give an allowance for energy or be coming online. It was a seamless transition. So it's almost a bifurcation of the economy in terms of the traditional formal government economy and also the informal online youth economy. And the resilience that we've seen and the bounce back has been tremendous. And even in the formal financial sector, we have seen record-breaking returns for the Nigerian banking sector just announced. And I think what we can see is that there hasn't been a lot of international investment outside of international aid on the African continent for the last few years. Nothing matched with the venture or private equity investment. So what that has mean is that a lot of bootstrap companies like Aloysius here, another catalyst working, a lot of companies that have been 10 years without funding that are now perfectly positioned to thrive in this kind of market.
Dan, what are you seeing on the ground, especially when it comes to Elizabeth's talk about some dynamism still on the ground?
Well, I think the pandemic exposed, as Thurman was saying, trends that have been happening for a long time. There are at least 1.7 billion people throughout the world who don't have access to financial services. I would say you could double that are underserved today. 100 million incremental people went into extreme poverty during the pandemic, and it disproportionately has affected women. It's affected many vulnerable populations. And so this was going on before, but the pandemic really, I think, cast a spotlight on it that we cannot ignore. Like, we are all a part of our communities. Businesses are a part of their communities. Governments are a part of not just their own country, but the world community. And so I think the pandemic is going to force us to think about how we think about the world in general, because I think when you have such unrest that Thurman was mentioning, as His Excellency was mentioning, that threatens the foundations of political systems as well. So I think it's a dangerous time, and I think we need to be sure that there's an equal recovery as best we can.
Just a reminder for our audience, if you have any questions, you have the NEF app, so you can send us your questions and I'll get them here and try to get them for you. But Dan, let me just go back to your point about, of course, the pandemic really exacerbating some of the existing problems, like Minister Thurman was saying. It's not that we didn't have a divide, we did, but it just worsened the situation. What about some of the bright spots? Because we also saw this acceleration of digitization and perhaps really the interconnectedness of the world. And what is PayPal doing there in order to have a recovery that includes everyone?
I mean, clearly the world leapfrogged into, call it actually the beginning of the digital era right now. And everything we do, the way we work, the way we live, the way we get our medicine, the way we educate ourselves went into a digital realm. The way we finance, the way we pay for things went digital. And I think, my hope for this, and the reason kind of I get up every morning excited about what we're trying to go do inside PayPal and working with others throughout the ecosystem is that I think there is a solution rooted in technology. I mean, everything is moving to the mobile phone. The mobile phone is getting less and less expensive. Like, you can get a good mobile phone now for like $25. And so it is a thing that's connecting us together. You have all the power of a bank branch in the palm of your hand right now. M-Pesa taught us that right away. And PayPal and M-Pesa now are interoperable so that you can work together. And I think if you use the technology, you can make the managing and moving of money faster, less expensive, and by doing that, hopefully drive some incremental financial health, which I think is, again, the bedrock of so many things.
At the same time, though, I have to wonder if it's also going to sort of increase the digital divide as well, because, of course, we know many people in Africa are still not connected to the internet. What have you seen, Mr. Vice President, when it comes to the pandemic and the acceleration of digitization?
Well, I think the gentleman who just spoke has it right. From Tanzania and the rest of the continent, we really see that there is an opportunity if the advanced world could share with Africa the digital technologies, right from screening, testing, and so on. And this would make a huge difference for us who are still struggling with such facilities. But in addition to that, we would need the multilateral institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional banks, to come in with even more financial support to really be able to enable sub-Saharan African countries to access and buy these technologies, buy these medicines to fight the pandemic. So there is an opportunity. It's not that, yes, indeed, there are challenges in terms of how fast we can absorb digital technologies, but already Africa has shown wonders, for example, in applying mobile technologies to reach our people in the rural areas. And I don't see any problem at all that we can catch up very easily. As I think it was said, the African people are innovative, they are resilient, they can match up fairly quickly as long as the digital technologies are shared with us.
Elizabeth, in terms of digital technologies being shared across Africa, what are you seeing, and what are perhaps some of the prospects of new technologies like blockchain that could actually accelerate some of the progress there?
Well, I mean, honestly, we joke about this a lot at the company, but the internet access in Kenya is better than in London sometimes. And I have a house in Lamu, which is on the remote northern border of Somalia and Kenya, and you have 5G access. thanks to some mesh networks that were set up by a local community. So mesh networks have been, 10-year project across Kenya, and we're seeing that all over East Africa, et cetera. Similarly, when you enter the airport in Senegal, on the other side of the continent, they've had fingerprint access, digital thermometer readings, ability to screen for COVID for some time now. So across the 55 markets, you see all sorts of levels of digitization. When we were the first company to introduce cryptocurrencies on the continent in 2013, which I guess was too soon. We had some bumps along the road, but now it's quite exciting to see the uptake. And actually, during the last 2 years, we've seen so many central banks move forward with legislation and policies that, have taken 8 years to move forward, and in the last 2 years have almost raced to the forefront, including the introduction of the e-Naira in Nigeria just last month.
Let's talk a little bit about the regulatory framework there, Minister Tharman, because Elizabeth was just saying that perhaps they introduced cryptocurrency a little bit too soon. What are the risks of that? And I know that you've been looking at crypto, blockchain, all from the lens of fintech and the opportunities that it presents.
Well, I think we've got to always start with the use case. What's the objective? Not what's the solution, but what's the objective? So Dan spoke about financial inclusion. That's a very large use case because a large part of the developing world still doesn't have financial inclusion. Even just internet access, right? A large part of the world, roughly 80% in the developing world, doesn't even have internet access. A large part of society, even within the advanced world, doesn't even have internet access. I'll give you an example, and it's really worth shining a light on this. About 20% of sub-Saharan Africa and a good part of the developing world has internet access, 80% don't. In Detroit, Milwaukee, Baltimore, it's about 30% of school-going children that live in homes with internet access. They're developing countries. So we've got to shine a light on the basic problems, and that defines our use case. How do we improve internet access? How do we get more learning inclusion? How do we raise standards? How do we have financial inclusion, access to credit for SMEs? Those are the big challenges of the world. Not so much the incremental changes in costs for cross-border payments and stuff. That's all interesting and useful, but those are small bore issues. The really big challenges are staring at us in the face. Inclusion and sustainability are huge challenges. The technologies exist for some of them, particularly for inclusion. The technologies are getting there for sustainability, still not fully bankable or investable, and we've got to accelerate it through a lot more public-private risk sharing. It requires risk sharing, not just support for collaboration. It requires money to be put, risk capital to be put in place to share risk, because otherwise the technologies aren't going to be in place in time for the next decade or next 15 years. Sustainability. So that's what it takes. And I think at the end of the day, if COVID has had a benefit, it is that it has illustrated, unfortunately in a tragic way, but it has illustrated that collaboration internationally is far, far less costly than not collaborating. And preparing in advance for pandemics and other crises is going to be far, far less costly than not preparing.
Let's talk a little bit about that collaboration and what you mentioned about public and private partnerships. Dan, how do you use that in order to ensure a safe ecosystem, and especially when it comes to perhaps upgrading the broader financial system?
Well, I think no company is an island unto itself. I think the business world is slowly but surely recognizing that we have multiple stakeholders. Those stakeholders include our communities, they include our employees, They include partnerships with governments and regulators and customers. And we need to think about what is our purpose as a company, and have both profit and purpose work hand in hand together. We can't just be about making money. We need to be about what is the impact we can make in the world. And I think some companies are talking about that, and others are actually doing things about that, putting their products, putting their capital to work to look at larger things than just the company itself. And I think that each of us have our own impact to make. We've got to do it in partnership together. There's no way that PayPal can make an impact without working with people like His Excellency and the Senior Minister and others around the world. We have to work hand in hand together. Regulations need to permit responsible innovation to happen. But there are so many things that we can do when we put our mind together. For instance, like we do these working capital loans. These working capital loans go to the 70% of states in the US where 10 or more banks have closed branches, which are underrepresented neighborhoods. And 70% of our loans go there. And it's because we use technology, we use different things and traditional FICO scores and that kind of thing to really think about how can our products help these underserved communities. That's part and parcel of our mission and part and parcel of what our values are as a company. And I think if all of us can lean into this, and there are ways that we can help in all parts of the world, I think the impact can be profound. We just can't think about it as like we can only do this. We have to think about it in its totality, but the impact could be quite substantial if we do that.
Elizabeth?
I couldn't agree more. And one example is that we process for 35 of the largest remittance companies in the world, and remittances are essential to the growth of the African continent. And it's not just the transaction costs. Most remittance companies struggle with accessing last mile, with accessing float, pre-funding, treasury. These might seem like, you know, esoteric ideas, but it's what actually opens up the flows of that 34 billion coming into the continent. And without fintechs and without technology companies to do the hard work of building into those APIs, digitizing the last mile, connecting the mobile money like M-Pesa, like MTN, like Orange, like Airtel, Bartik, into the banks, and the banks into them, and to the cash networks, that's when we get that seamless layer, and then development money, private sector money can flow. But until we get that infrastructure built, it's really a bottleneck to a lot of growth. I worked for 5 years in microfinance across the continent, and I saw this huge bottleneck into accessing funds.
Right.
And the second part is about the use of the dollar. So a lot of the funds distributed across the African continent are still distributed in US dollars and then on lent in local currency, causing a huge FX mismatch, which is something that needs to be addressed.
I can just build on that. International remittances are one of the most important inflows into certain economies. And traditionally, the international remittance, the fees for that can be up to 8%. If you go digital wallet to digital wallet, you can do that at 80% reduced cost. That, when you look at the flows that go in international remittance, it's a huge number, getting money to those who most need it.
Mr. Vice President, what's your view on what's being said right now? And let me just also add to that a question from our audience who's asking, the challenges have been highlighted, but what are the opportunities for emerging economies? And the reason that I'm putting those two together is because at the end of the day, you can support developing economies, but you also need that private capital to flow by itself. And how do you make yourself more attractive?
Well, first, before that, I wanted to follow up again on the technology issue. I think there are simple things that we really need to work on. One of the issues which concern us in Tanzania is the whole issue of having a responsible social media. So, for example, instead of giving a balanced view on the vaccines, some of these social medias are really talking about, the result in making people impotent, they cause sudden death and that kind of. And in the rural setting, even in urban areas, it is very difficult for ordinary people to basically say this information on the social media is incorrect. Right. That kind of information is the right one. And therefore, for example, the phobia we are seeing on vaccines partly stems from what I think is irresponsible social media. And both of us have a responsibility to make sure that we are educating our populations and giving them the right information to be able to fight this pandemic. Right. But also let me add that I think I would like to see the developed world supporting us in what I see as the positive side, the opportunities that have arose from COVID-19. For example, there are some industries that are now coming up to produce sanitizers and that kind of. And I think it is important that we provide incentives to those industries using fiscal policies internally, but also facilitating trade importation of various inputs that go into such industries. But even more important, I think, I would like to see the developed world cooperating with us on R&D. And in terms of some could relocate some of the industries manufacturing the vaccines, for example, to the African continent. They can work with our local researchers to push the knowledge frontier. So I think there are ways in which, if we work together, we can defeat this pandemic fairly quickly, as compared to now that, yes, we are innovative, we are resilient, depending on the circumstances we are in. For example, in Tanzania, we decided not to go for a total lockdown, because for a population that really depends on a daily subsistence way of life, if you close them, you go for a total lockdown, it's almost imposing on a gas chamber, which we couldn't do. So yes, there are solutions that we can push for. It's not just the effects. We are perfectly capable of finding solutions to move ahead.
Minister Tharman, let me ask you a longer term question, of course, when it comes to the broader international financial system. What can we learn from this pandemic when it comes to building a sustainable environment where we do see opportunities for everyone?
So first, by the way, I should say that I agree entirely with what Elizabeth and Dan were saying about remittances. So don't get me wrong. The cost of financial inclusion is a serious issue, and remittances are a significant part of earnings for a large part of the population in the developing world. So reducing the cost of that is a very good thing. On your broader question, I would say, and this touches on what Dr. Mpango just said, to be honest about it, if we try to tackle a pandemic after it is started, it is very costly and it's going to take a very long time. And that's what we've learned in COVID. Speed and scale is everything. And if you start only after a pandemic has broken out, even with the best efforts and the best private enterprise and the most remarkable speed of vaccine development, we're still in a situation where 20 months on, the majority of the world's population hasn't had a jab in their arms. So we have to prepare beforehand, and that's a huge lesson coming out of COVID-19. We must have ahead of time manufacturing and distribution capabilities ahead of time. And there's no way the private sector or the markets are going to deliver that. First, they don't know exactly which pathogen is going to be the source of the pandemic. They don't know which vaccine is going to succeed and get through phase 3 trials. So it requires public-private collaboration in a much deeper sense. To be honest, the US did it quite well. The US, through BARDA and that whole combination of government agencies, did it quite well. It was developed over the years. In the last year and a half, in an almost un-American way, government did well in the US. Even the US Army was involved in the logistics, right? And we need to have a global BARDA. That's what we need, to develop ahead of time with public money sharing risk, all the way from R&D to developing the manufacturing capability. Have ever-warm manufacturing facilities, which you use as best as you can in normal times, because you've got TB, you've got malaria, you've got a whole set of endemic diseases, and you've got to, as best as you can, use those facilities to deal with endemic diseases in order to then pivot in a pandemic. So starting once a pandemic has broken out, you've got to try your very best, mobilize resources as best as you can, but even with those best efforts, it not only takes long, but you allow mutations to evolve, and the pandemic becomes longer for everyone. It's hugely costly. So just going back to the simple point, the cost of preparing in advance is infinitesimal compared to the cost of not preparing. That's the lesson of COVID. And it requires international collaboration, and the cost of collaboration is infinitesimal compared to the cost of not collaborating.
On that note, we'll leave the conversation here. Of course, those lessons that we've learned through COVID and perhaps what we can do next. Minister Tharman, thank you very much. Dan, Elizabeth, Mr. Vice President, it was great having you at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage our moderator, John Micklethwaite, and 40th Secretary of Commerce of the United States, Gina Raimondo.
Thank you very much. 40th Secretary of Commerce makes you sort of adds a certain amount to it. We were going to discuss two big things which are of massive interest to everyone here. The first, and both within your brief, come back to US competitiveness generally in a bit, but I thought we might begin with trade. And you've been on a lightning tour, jet lag tour of Asia, with Malaysia next. And you said in Japan that you wanted to form an economic framework that would be even better than CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you said it could be even more robust in some ways than the traditional free trade agreement. And this is this Indo-Pacific framework which America has been talking about. And I think many of the business people here would say, look, we would rather have a trade pact. That's what we want. And I know that's difficult politically, but maybe you could spell out exactly what this means and why it is better.
Yeah. So thank you. It's good to be with you, and hello to everybody. I think that, look, I understand that. You know, I began my week in Tokyo. I'm here now. I'll be heading off to Malaysia. I'm meeting also I'm here with my counterparts from New Zealand and Australia, and we hear that. We hear that. You know, CPTPP, we want America in. Here's what I would say. For various reasons, you know, that is not going to happen now. But President Biden is crystal clear. When he says America is back, he means back with our allies and back in this region. So since he's been in office, the Vice President has been in Vietnam, Secretary of Defense has been here, I am here, USTR Thai is here. We are very serious in re-engaging economically with the Indo-Pacific. And when we talk about the topics, it is broader in some ways and a little bit less restrained or constrained than a traditional free trade agreement. For example, we can talk about partnerships around the supply chain, specific partnerships around working together to make sure that we and our allies in the region have a redundant and secure supply chain. You know, Australia has critical minerals that we all need. We can talk specifically and somewhat more flexibly about partnerships. Interoperability, which is critical to facilitate digital trade. Tech standards. You know, we were talking backstage about artificial intelligence. You know, you wouldn't see setting tech standards in a traditional free trade agreement, but it is vital. Who's going to write the rules of the road for emerging technology? We want to write the rules of the road with our like-minded allies in this region. Semiconductors. You know, so I think that decarbonization and green.
Should we see this as sort of the trade equivalent of what people talked about at one time of a kind of coalition of democracies? This is America and its allies in Asia getting together in an economic way which does not involve a specific trade pact, but which involves a series of kind of complicated alliances building up to that.
I think that's exactly, that is well said. And, you know...
You can hire me if you want.
I'm sure I could not afford you. But I think that is well said. And, you know, I'm here in the region beginning the discussions, laying the groundwork. We're likely to launch a more formal process in the beginning of next year, which will culminate in a proper economic framework in the region. And
does that mean an actual agreement?
Yeah. Exactly.
Do you accept that part of the cost of this is, as you know, China and for that matter Taiwan have both applied to join the CPTPP, that could be a consequence of it, that China becomes part of the trade agreement that America left under Donald Trump?
Yeah. So I will say this. China is going to do what China is going to do, and whether or not the current members of CPTPP allow China to come in, that will be as it will be. What I'm talking about is about working with our allies in the region, allies we've had for decades, in an incredibly important and fast-growing region. You know, in the Indo-Pacific, 940 million people are entering the middle class in the next 7 to 10 years. You know, it's 4.6 billion people. Here in Singapore, some of the best innovation and technology in the world. So this isn't about China. This is about developing robust commercial and economic relationships with our partners in the Indo-Pacific, where we have had a robust relationship for a long time, but for the past few years. I mean, the elephant in the room, the reality is America has been absent. We have been absent from the largely absent in the past few years. And when I am here in the region, there seems to be a strong pull to have us back. And so we want to work towards this agreement.
One last thing on that. I mean, watching or listening to Wang Qishan talking earlier, it was interesting to me how many times he mentioned the word multilateral, multilateral, multilateral. Does it sort of worry you at all that China might be seen as taking up the banner of multilateralism whilst America is seen in this more a la carte way?
So again, I think that we just have to, as I often say, we have to kind of run faster in America and play our game in America. We have our strategy. America is a fantastic and benign and collaborative ally and partner. We have some of the best entrepreneurs, the deepest capital markets in the world, and a long history of working in this region. So we're going to do what we know how to do, and China will do what it's going to do.
You mentioned international standards, and again, just talking to Henry Kissinger earlier, the all-important issue of artificial intelligence, which also goes into your brief on competitiveness. This is the industry of the future. Who is going to write the rules of artificial intelligence, and what do you see as America's role in that?
So I think this is an enormously important topic. If you think about the internet, which of course was incredibly powerful, transformative, disruptive, it primarily affected advertising in the advertising market and e-commerce, retail. Two relatively small pieces of our economy. Now you look at AI. AI will change fundamentally logistics, biotechnology, healthcare, every single aspect of our economy. So I think that it's really impossible to overestimate what is coming in terms of disruption, transformation, change, and progress with respect to AI, which means, first of all, we have to get it right in how we regulate. But secondly, we absolutely have to make sure that like-minded partners who share values around anti-discrimination, privacy, human rights, are together writing the rules of the road. So, for example, that's part of what I'm talking about when I sit down with Malaysia, when I sit down with Singapore. I had a great discussion yesterday with the tech minister in Singapore on exactly this topic, which is we share the same values. So we should be writing the rules of the road. We should be setting forth the tech standards and governance models for the appropriate and safe use of AI.
But are there particular bits within that? Is there particular sort of mini battlefields within that trying to set standards in AI that you really want to focus on?
So I would say this. I think this has to be very use case specific. So AI as applied to biotechnology will be different from AI as applied to logistics. And certainly, there can be no room for the use of AI for, surveillance or anything that purveys discrimination or that kind of gets into ethical questions. So it's enormously complex. I think the trick is use case specific, industry specific, flexibility. Right? This is an emerging field. We're in I don't know a ton about sports, so I should be careful, but like second or third inning of AI. So we have to regulate and be careful for the dangers, but the potential is enormous. So we have to have some flexibility and sensible regulations that we develop in partnership with industry and stakeholders and like-minded allies.
That leads a bit into the idea of American competitiveness, and I suppose, again, many of the business people here would look at what's happening in America, and they would see that there's been a renewed focus, and you've been at the front of it, in terms of sort of focusing on industries, focusing on different parts of the American economy to push forward. But they would also say, look, a lot of Biden's bills also involve things like giving jobs to Americans, unions, all those things, which is precisely what goes down badly in the rest of the world. Is there an element that America First harms America's attempts to help the other side of your brief, the trade brief?
Yeah. So like everything, it's a balance. President Biden is, as you say, extremely focused on creating good quality jobs in America, and emphasis on quality. Right? Decent pay, decent benefits, decent working conditions. Having said that, we are equally focused on kind of re-strengthening our relationships with our allies in Europe, in the Indo-Pacific, and around the world. And I think that, we talk about onshoring but we're also talking about friend shoring. And it isn't realistic. Take semiconductors. It is a global, complex supply chain. I'll be going to Malaysia tomorrow, visiting advanced manufacturing facilities and semiconductor facilities. That won't change, right? And that is okay. That is a good thing. We don't think that everything can be domestically produced. So we want to work with our allies and friend shore. But yes, of course, we also want to enhance domestic supply of semiconductor chips.
Do you think the nature of the debate about competitiveness has changed, partly because of what's happening with China, but also partly because of COVID? It has made countries that used to espouse what might be broadly described as kind of free market principles, it's made them think much harder about what industries they need to keep at home.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, semiconductors is the best example. There's a global shortage of semiconductors. I was at a CEO roundtable earlier of a variety of different companies, and they were all saying, we can't get our hands on enough chips. So there's global demand has vastly outstripped global supply. In the United States effectively, invented, or the semiconductor industry was born in the US. And we, in search of cheap labor overseas, we've watched that dwindle. We now make, 0% of the world's most sophisticated chips in America. We only make 12 or 13% of global supply. A couple decades ago, we made 40%. So we absolutely need to increase domestic supply. By the way, not necessarily just by American companies. Like there are companies in Japan and Korea and Taiwan, which we hope will set up shop in America and have domestic production. But at the same time, we do need to collaborate even in a tighter way with our allies. I mean, these global supply chains are, by their nature, global, and we have to shore up those partnerships. And it's about the supplies as well, like critical minerals for batteries, minerals for semiconductors. So it's, complex.
You can imagine somebody, though, from an American perspective, saying, look at, the Biden administration has come in talking about the need to build a bigger technology industry, but you're also the people who are pushing antitrust policy, which I know is not yours, towards the big tech giants. You see a lot of people here from big banks and so on. You look at Wall Street, it's another massive area of American competitive strength, and yet there's definitely some desire to rein in Wall Street in the Biden administration. How do you sort of, from somebody who's trying to sell US competitiveness, but also bring the Democratic Party with you, how do you do that?
I think it is really quite consistent, which is to say we're pro-competition. Competition is what has formed the basis of such a successful, innovative, and vibrant economy. And so whether it's big tech or any other big company, if there are anti-competitive factors at play, that hurts competition, that hurts startups, that snuffs out innovation. The American capital markets are, as you say, robust and liquid, and that is a good thing, right? America is still the best place to start a business.
You don't see a kind of contradiction between, I suppose, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and your job, to the extent that there is, I suppose, considerable anger with capitalism and various sorts of it on one part of the Democratic Party, and you, on the other hand, are trying to boost American business.
I would say this. It is true. I am, and President Biden is, self-proclaimed capitalist and self-proclaimed pro-business. We want to have policies which encourage innovation and business growth, and that is important. Having said that, look, the excesses of capitalism are on full display in America. They have led to a lack of competition, a concentration of wealth at the top, which is threatening to our democracy and to capitalism itself. So I don't actually see the tension. I think I actually think we cannot continue to have a vibrant democracy or entrepreneurial scene with this concentration of power or wealth. And so I think it's healthy, actually. I think you can be both. I think you can be both. We have to move towards a more inclusive, equal form of capitalism where businesses are successful, but workers are also successful.
You talked about the excess of capitalism, and one very obvious area is the environment. We had COP last week. Do you see that as America setting off on a new, in a new way when it comes to the environment? You heard Mike earlier talk about the necessity of getting rid of coal and things like that. Is that part of your vision? How green is your vision of American, the newly competitive America you're building?
I'd say very green, totally green. And in that regard, huge opportunities for job creation, for innovation, and for collaboration with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. So, look, the reality is we will not be able to achieve the goals that we all want to and need to as it relates to decarbonization without more innovation. Like scientists will tell you 25% of the goal will be achieved by technology that doesn't exist. So that means, venture capital, entrepreneurs, innovation, research and development, bigger investments in research and development are critical. The president just signed the $1 trillion infrastructure package. In that package is the biggest climate investment ever in the history of the United States. Huge investments for electric vehicle charging stations, tax incentives to innovate. So I think, and there's a lot of innovation going on in this region. So I think very green, but I think if we do it right, it will create millions of jobs. And the challenge is that we have to bring everybody along. I mean, the reality is if you're in a coal-affected community, when you hear climate change, you get nervous, you hear I'm losing my job. So it's on us to have a just transition and make sure that everybody's included.
You used to be a governor, famously, but putting on that hat, how difficult is it to sell greenery on the doorstep?
Yeah, it can be difficult. And I think we should be real about the challenges. It is necessary, and we have to move forward aggressively and as robustly as possible. But if you live in West Virginia or Kentucky or Ohio, Pennsylvania, and it is the only way you're a third or fourth or fifth generation coal family, it can be difficult. And I think that we have to, those concerns are valid. I was the governor of Rhode Island, not a coal community, but a manufacturing community. And when I talked about tech, that made people a little nervous. They wanted old line manufacturing. And so I think if we will be successful in bringing people along, you have to be real about the challenge, but also meet the needs. Provide jobs, provide new jobs, provide job training.
One last thing is that, as you said, you were a governor. Now you've entered this horrific world of cabinets and things where you're a part of it. What's the biggest change in that? I mean, you were always seen as one of the great pragmatists of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
Once it actually comes to working in an administration, how different is that?
I'd like to think I still am a great pragmatist. A couple of weeks ago, I was able to resolve the 232 steel and aluminum tariffs with the Europeans. I'm here, practically looking to kind of make deals and make things happen on the supply chain issues. I'm in the middle talking to businesses. So I'm so far finding it to be a place in this administration, and the president encourages this, get things done. I'm not one for the high-minded jargon, like let's get things done, and so far I've been able to find my spots to do that.
With slightly more jet lag.
Quite a bit more jet lag.
Secretary Raimondo, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was struggling with my jet lag.
Please welcome to the stage Andrew Brown.
Sorry. Before you go, thank you, John. Thank you, Secretary Raimondo. That concludes the morning program, and I'm here to deliver a few housekeeping notes. So we're going to reassemble in this room at 2:45 p.m. And in the interim, 2.5 hours or so, you're welcome to join our breakout sessions to conduct your one-on-one conversations, meetings, and to have lunch. So we recommend you go into the Bloomberg app and refer to My Schedule. And within My Schedule, you'll see all the meetings that you've set up or have been set up for you, and when the breakout sessions start and finish. So the breakout rooms are scattered around this campus. The gallery is right outside the main doors here. Then there's a suite of rooms upstairs on the second floor, and I think it's Sentosa 1, 2, and 3. If you've signed up for the scenario planning, that's in Manor 8. So to get to Manor 8, you should go up to the main lobby of the hotel, and there are carts that will take you to Manor 8. So as far as lunch arrangements are concerned, you have two options. The restaurants are open, and so you can have group lunches in the restaurant, sit-down lunches. Otherwise, there are lunch boxes from the cafes around here, and you can sort of have a quick lunch. If you're going to Manor 8, the buses start leaving at 12, and there is lunch available at Manor 8 before that session starts at 1:15. I think I've got all that right. Thank you very much. See you at 2:45.